Hello and welcome back to the Microlearning Institute. In this tutorial we look at the concept of Porter's 5 forces. The Porter's 5 forces tool helps us to analyse what are called the structural determinants of profitability in an industry sector. Porter's 5 forces suggests that the microeconomic environment or the competitive environment of an industry is governed by 5 forces that impact that sector. One of these forces, the central one here, is what we call industry rivalry, and we'll have a closer look at that just in a short while. Next, the other force is called the bargaining power of suppliers. Another force that impacts the competitive environment is the bargaining power of buyers. And the final two forces are the threat of substitute products and also the threat of new entrants to the competitive environment. Let's look at these forces individually. Firstly, let's look at the bargaining power of suppliers, or supplier power. And this force assesses how easy it is for suppliers to drive up prices. And this is driven by the number of suppliers of each key input. Now, obviously, if there are many suppliers of a particular raw material to a sector or an industry, then each individual supplier has lower bargaining power. Whereas, of course, if there's one key supplier to an industry or very few key suppliers, then the suppliers have very high bargaining power. Similarly, the uniqueness of a product or service. If a product is unique, then the bargaining power of the supplier who supplies it is higher than if a product is quite generic. The cost of switching from one product to another. So if it's very expensive to switch from our current source of supply to another source of supply, if there's a lot of legislation or a lot of technology changes or a lot of programming changes that have to be done, then the bargaining power of that supplier is quite high. Next, let's look at another force in Porter's 5 forces, which is the bargaining power of buyers. And this buyer power considers how easy it is for buyers to drive prices down in a particular competitive environment. This power is driven by the number of buyers. If there are many buyers, then individually each of these buyers has lower bargaining power than if there were fewer buyers in a particular sector. The importance of each individual buyer to your business. Now again, this suggests that if we have one major customer, that one major customer will have more bargaining power over our pricing than if we had many customers, and really we could afford to lose some of those customers. Buyer power is also influenced by the cost to them of switching from your products and services. So quite the opposite effect here from what we saw with the supplier power. If it's easy for the customer to switch from your product or service to a competitor's, then they have very high bargaining power. But of course, if it's quite difficult for them to disentangle themselves from their contractual obligations with you, then they have very low bargaining power. Next, let's look at the central force in Porter's 5 forces, the force of industry rivalry or competitive rivalry. And this is governed by the number and the capability of competitors in a sector. If no other company can do what your company does, then your company has tremendous strength. And of course, consequently, there's very low competitive rivalry for your company. Next, let's look at the threat of substitutes to a particular competitive environment. And again, this is affected by the ability of customers to find a different way of doing what a company does or what your company does. If substitution is easy and substitution is viable, then this weakens the power of the company. Finally, let's have a look at the threat of new entrants. And if a company has strong and durable barriers to entry, it can preserve a favourable position and take fair advantage of that favourable position. Alternatively, if it's easy to enter the market and compete effectively, then new competitors can quickly enter and weaken the existing company's position. In this latter case, we say that there are very low barriers to entry, so the threat of new entrants is high, so consequently the profitability of the sector will be reduced. Thank you very much for watching this short tutorial on the topic of Porter's 5 forces presented by the Microlearning Institute.